Next up, Carol Woodin will share some of the intriguing stories behind a selection of artworks in the U.S. exhibition, A More Abundant Future, as well as some of the other 29 exhibitions in the Botanical Art Worldwide project.
Carol Woodin is the director of exhibitions for the American Society of Botanical Artists and an accomplished and award-winning artist. Carol's main obsession has always been orchids, but rare wildflowers, heirloom fruits, and other interesting plants are fair game. Her artwork has been exhibited around the world. Her work is in the collections of the Royal Botanical Gardens Kew, the Smithsonian Institution, the Hunt Institute, and numerous private and corporate collections throughout the Americas and Europe. She is a recent winner of the prestigious Shirley Sherwood Award for Botanical Art. So without further ado, Carol, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Jody, for that introduction and that background on the Worldwide Project. I have to tell you all that my biggest problem was to try to trim down the number of things to show you because there were so many thrilling things that people have been painting and drawing for this project. I'm going to share my screen here. And it's really exciting to see this Botanical Art Worldwide project come to fruition. As Jody mentioned, I'm here to show you a sampler of some of the fascinating plants that have been depicted around the world and to talk a little about them in terms of their relationship to the theme. If you see a country that's missing, they are not intentionally left out. Each country has its own schedule relating to that May 18th date, and so some are not ready on this earlier timeline. Jody has already been through the description of the different categories of plants that are acceptable, so I'm just going to skim right over that slide and go back. We're going to begin our global circumnavigation with North America. And so we're going to start talking about this stunning artwork that we chose to represent our exhibition, this watercolor by Karen Klugeline of Prunus maritima, also a great subject for this project. It's a wild food, and you can see that it's a plum. It is a tough and resilient shrub that grows along shorelines in the northeastern US, and it can form dense thickets with other dune-dwelling plants. It survives windstorms, some salt spray, and poor sandy soils of mature dune systems. It's resistant to a prevalent pest of stone fruits in the US, the black knot fungus. One of the most important things about crop wild relatives is that they can potentially be hybridized with cultivated varieties to impart some characteristic to the cultivated variety, such as a resistance to disease. A resurgence in popularity has occurred with the locavore movement, and it is foraged for fresh eating and making into jams, which is why Karen named her painting Beach Plum Jam. Mainly because of seaside development, it is considered endangered in Maine, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. At the same time, it's being considered as a niche agricultural crop. The second painting I wanted to show you is this painting of Jean Emmons because of, well, several different reasons. She was inspired in doing this painting by two squash paintings, both by Italian artists, one by Giovanna Garzoni from the late 1600s, and one a contemporary work by Marzio Tamer. Her rainbow treatment of these three heritage squashes is an artistic tour de force. Additionally, the watercolor provides information about the plant's vining habit, about the flowers and how the fruit develops from them, and then the fascinating surfaces of the fruits themselves. There's evidence that crops in the genus Cucurbita were domesticated 8,000 years ago, and like many other crops, these originated in Mesoamerica. They've traveled to every corner of the world, and now the leading grower of squash and pumpkins in the world is China, with India its second leading grower. Although here in the US, we only eat pumpkin seeds, all squash seeds, like the ones Jean displays in the cut specimen, are edible and nutritious. An extensive conservation strategy has been developed for crops in the Cucurbitaceae, which contains some of the world's most valuable crops, by the Global Crop Diversity Trust. Part of the crop diversity story revolves around the idea of diversifying our own food sources from the 8 or 10 that form the vast majority of our diet, with foods that have natural resistance to diseases, have few pests, and tolerate growing conditions with fewer inputs needed. Apios americana, painted here in a circular composition by Betsy Rogers Knox, is a plant that shows potential in all of these regards. Plant breeders collected samples of this legume from around the US and in Canada to develop a program at Louisiana State, and in 10 years were able to increase the size of the tuber from dime-sized to potato-sized. This painting on the left by Deborah Shaw illustrates teosinte, the wild Mesoamerican plant that archaeological and genetic evidence identifies as a progenitor of our modern corn. Approximately 9,000 years ago, farmers in southwest Mexico began to domesticate the lowland teosinte. It's remarkable that our modern day corn is a result of thousands of years of hybridization and selection by farmers, first in Mexico, then throughout North and Central America, then around the world. Last year, more than 1 billion metric tons of corn were produced in the US, with the US as its #1 producer. Deb Shaw painted this in watercolor on vellum and has grown teosinte for the past few years just so she could paint it, but only one type at a time to prevent cross-fertilization. She sourced her seeds from Native Plant Seed Search and at the US National Plant Germplasm System. I put my own corn painting alongside Deb's to show visually how the plant has been altered by these human changes. Most crops we consume started long ago in history with wild plants like this Zea maize on the left, and through thousands of years of hybridization and selection, we have something like what you see on the right, something far increased in edible quantity and quality. It makes me wonder how those first people, thousands of years ago, figured out how to start this whole process in motion. This autophylle corn is a flint corn cultivated by Native Americans in the northeastern US for hundreds of years before they were taken over to Italy in the 19th century and became a prime polenta corn. Now they're being grown back here where I live in the Hudson Valley by the Hudson Valley Seed Company, which is where I found my subject. So we're going to go alphabetically, and first we're going to start in Africa. I've used this painting of the hybrid Eureka lemon by Isabelita Van Ziel as a transition slide here, partly because there were few citrus depicted for this project, but also because, perhaps surprisingly, citrus is a major export crop of South Africa, and South Africa is second only to Spain in the value of citrus it exports. Marama bean is a perennial legume that grows in southern Africa and is well adapted to low moisture soil. Its tubers store water and nutrients, and its drought tolerance gives hope that it could be adaptable to semi-arid regions where such crops are needed. Marama bean is nutritionally rich, with high protein in both the tubers and in the seeds, comparable to soybeans. It has a high percentage of oil, similar to peanut oil, and the seeds, when roasted, are similar to roasted cashew nuts. In the painting, artist Ann Norris shows the creeping nature of the vine, as well as the tuber, and the seeds both in and out of the pods. The seeds and tubers have long been collected and consumed in the areas of southern Africa where they are found. You can always count on Jillian Condi to make a beautiful painting. This graceful and complex watercolor of Lablab purpurea is not only a joy to look at, but it contains a wealth of information about the vegetative characteristics of the plant. Jillian shows leaves that are a cooler color on the undersides, the brilliant reddish purple pods and bright pink flowers, and the vining habit of the plant. It's an African native crop now cultivated throughout the tropics. Although the wild vine is perennial, it has been extensively bred for cultivation, so many cultivars are annuals or short-lived perennials. Its value as a food crop is high because although it's primarily found in tropical and subtropical areas, it's also adaptable to temperate climates. It's native to India as well, and it's recorded there for about 5,000 years. People eat both the beans and the pods, but they have to be cooked several times with fresh water to remove cyanogenic glycosides that are poisonous. Now we're going to go into Asia, and our transition slide for Asia is this remarkable Fuyu persimmon painting by Japanese artist Yoko Harada, who received ASBA's Lizzie Sanders Award this year. This is a lovely deciduous fruit tree that is native to East Asia and India, and it is missing that astringency that's characteristic of many persimmons. In Asia, we'll start with India, a first-time participant in Botanical Art Worldwide. Purna Gupta has drawn this pomegranate in colored pencil, and although this fruit has made its way around the world, it's believed to have originated in Afghanistan and Iran, then finding its way to Asia, Africa, and Europe. India is a top producer of pomegranates, both for domestic consumption and export, and it has naturalized in some areas. The market for pomegranates is growing, responding to consumer demand for what is considered a superfood with its rich profile of antioxidants. Cariano Apic counts as one of my most admired artists. He does numerous complex and accomplished paintings of orchids, but other plants too. Here he trains his eye and brush on a fascinating plant that is in the grass family. This painting is remarkable in its depiction of the plant at various stages from sprouting seed to immature plant to fully seed bearing. You can see the grass affinity in its flowers. This is the cultivated variety of what's called Job's tears, and its grain has a soft shell. As noted in the title, it can be considered as a replacement for rice with some advantages in that it can be grown in higher elevations where rice doesn't thrive. The soft hulls can be pressed over a sieve and the grains do not need to be polished. This allows higher nutrition to remain in the grain. Job's tears are native to Southeast Asia and it's cultivated through Asia, but it is also naturalized in some areas in the Americas. I chose the second painting from Indonesia as it's another one that I'm in awe of. I'm actually a bit envious of the painting. I planted this snake gourd myself a couple summers ago as it looked like a fascinating plant to paint. However, all I have to say is that it did not thrive. It was probably a blessing in disguise, though, because I never could have reached the pinnacle of this beautifully rendered depiction. The movement and the composition is quite snake-like, and Unique Nugroho has used tendrils to tie it all together, showing the different colors of the long, narrow squash and its unusual interior with a cutaway. She has placed the distinctive lacy flowers in front of a leaf to throw those tiny curls into relief. And I'm going to zoom in here a little bit so you can see that a little better. Isn't that something? All the details are captured, including the little spiky hairs on the outside of the gourds and the longer ones on the inside. This is another edible crop in the Cucurbitaceae and is eaten throughout South and Southeast Asia in curries and stews. Now we move on to Japan, and they have curated a fascinating exhibition with such well-known Japanese crop plants as wasabi and persimmons. Akiko Inokido's depiction of Adzuki bean is one of the stars. This is yet another complex tour de force showing roots, flowers, and the vine heavy laden with pods with both ripe and ripening beans. In Japan, Adzuki bean is the second most important bean after soy, and more than 300 cultivars and land races are registered there. These red beans serve as a filling in Japanese sweets, and throughout East Asia, it's also used often after sweetening, sometimes boiling to produce red bean paste. The beans are highly nutritious with a variety of important minerals, B vitamins, and proteins. I couldn't resist Mieko Ishikawa's watercolor and pen and ink of the Japanese walnut. It does produce delicious edible walnuts, but they are on the small side and is with all walnuts. They take a little bit of work to extract them. Mieko has documented every aspect of this tree using a combination of line drawing and color to convey the different aspects of its life cycle. Native to Japan and the Kuril Islands, Mieko has shown the enlarged and life-size female flowers, and those are these in red here, and the long green male catkins, and that's these here, and the nuts with a shell and a cluster with their husks still intact. The painting is a masterclass in greens. Bansakti Chakapak of Thailand has painted one of the most delicious fruits that can be found anywhere, with one seemingly torn away. He's asked the question, who ate the ripe custard apple in his title? And that question could be answered by imagining its deliciousness. There is little that wouldn't want to eat this custard apple. It's a native of the American tropics and was brought to Asia via the Philippines by Spanish traders. It is cultivated and naturalized in the tropics and subtropics around the world. I wanted to include a wild banana in this talk because of the importance of bananas as a food crop worldwide and their precariousness because of a lack of diversity in the crop. This ink drawing by Narongsak Sukewamni, I just butchered that name, Sukemani, shows its growth habit and the prolific number of bananas it can produce in line and stipple. The most cultivated bananas in the world are a group of cultivars called Cavendish, which are triploids derived from Musa acuminata. They're propagated by cloning and so have low genetic diversity, leading to vulnerability to diseases. And this is a good example of a wild subspecies that might be used to impart an important characteristic to the commercial crop, such as fungal resistance. Wild animals find them as delicious as we do and are important in dispersing seed. Korean artist Ji Yeon-koo has painted 16 heirloom varieties of Korean rice in a composition with a bouquet of sheaves of rice in the middle and enlarged grains of the 16 varieties lined up below. It reveals a diversity in color and morphology among these revived varieties. Ji-yeon worked with the National Arboretum in Korea, where she's been an admired teacher and illustrator for many years. The Arboretum engaged a farmer to grow some of the rice varieties that had been stored in the Korean National Seed Bank for 100 years. This original painting appeared in our Abundant Future exhibition, which opened at the New York Botanical Garden and traveled the US for 2 years. As you can tell, some of the paintings I've chosen, I have to confess that the plants they illustrate are personal favorites of mine. This is another one I've long hoped to paint, and I've seen it cultivated at Wave Hill, a garden in New York City. This is a master class on painting a vine, showing every aspect of this unusual, bumpy, bitter gourd in a watercolor by Korean artist Kim Min-seo. Vine paintings are always fascinating because they can be very difficult to organize onto a picture plane. This one is masterfully handled, showing the fruit in all its stages and even cut open in both lateral and transverse sections, so you can visually explore the interior as well. It's another cucurbita. This one originated in Africa, where it was a forage staple food of early hunter-gatherers, but was probably domesticated in Southeast Asia. It is cooked in stir fries and curries and can be pickled. It's usually eaten in its green or yellow form before it reaches the stage shown here on the left, where it opens up and reveals those seeds. Mm. This watercolor by Singapore artist Y. Hove depicts a crop plant that has been important for thousands of years, taro. It is believed to have originated in southern India and Southeast Asia, but there is still a lot that's unknown about its origin and domestication. Taro was carried into Polynesia in about 1300 BC, but archaeological records go back to over 10,000 years. They do well in moist soils and, like most root crops, are roasted and boiled for consumption. The International Network for Edible Aroids has a core sample of 170 different cultivars maintained in vitro in Fiji, but there are thought to be thousands of varieties. It's an important staple crop in many parts of Asia, Oceania, and Africa. I've combined two artworks by Singapore artist Kelly Bassett of a water apple, which shows how each medium delivers information about the plant in different ways. Water apple is an evergreen tree native to Asia and Australia that thrives in moist tropical lowland. The red bell-shaped fruit even looks delicious. It doesn't bruise easily and it keeps well. The tree is beautiful enough to be planted as an ornamental with its beautiful white flowers that are shown in each of these artworks. And this is an example of a heritage utilitarian crop, the paper mulberry. Taiwan artist Lydia Liang has illustrated the tree's remarkable morphological variety in its leaves, as well as its male and female flowers and inflorescence. Paper mulberry is native to a broad range of Asia and was cultivated by ancient Austronesians to make bark cloth and was widely transported throughout the islands. Today, its use is largely for ceremonial items and in making bags and bedding. The mulberry was important in the history of paper because of its durability. It's still used for contemporary fine paper making. Art papers from the inner bark of the mulberry are made in Korea and Japan, and we artists are familiar with its use in making conservation hinges for mounting artworks to a backing board for framing. This watercolor painting by Turkish artist Nurcihan Karyaman shows three of the most important grain crops in the world today: barley, rye, and durum wheat. Turkey is central to the history of wheat. The earliest evidence of domesticated emmer wheat from which durum wheat was derived comes from southeastern Anatolia about 8,000 years ago. You can see that each of these spikes is quite similar visually, and each requires several steps after harvest to separate the kernels and process them before they arrive in your kitchen. And here's another very important crop in the world, Papaver somniferum, or the opium poppy. It's cultivated for its edible seeds, and this painting by Turkish artist Mehmet Kavlak deftly shows a cluster of dried seed pods. But the main use of the poppy is, of course, medicinal, as it is a source of a powerful pharmaceutical painkiller in the form of opium or for other of its alkaloids, which are used in derivative medications. Although it is one of the most important medicines for alleviating severe pain, it is also, of course, cultivated and sold illicitly around the world. The two uses, food on the one hand and medicine on the other, require opposite characteristics in the crop. So some varieties require as low alkaloid levels as possible, and others require as high a content as possible. Now we're traveling to Australia, and the transition image for the Australian continent is this heirloom garlic, Te Mata that was painted by Yvonne Van Oort. This variety of garlic is among those cultivated and selected by the same family for 4 generations at the base of New Zealand's Te Mata Peak. Hickspethia pinnatifolia is a rare and vulnerable small, slender rainforest tree and relative of the macadamia. It produces edible nuts, which are eaten when fresh. The nut has a texture similar to coconut flesh and tastes like a cross between a macadamia and a coconut. It's found in Australia, in Queensland, and New South Wales. Beverly Allen has used watercolor to depict the racemes of flowers and nuts in a naturalistic pose. There are only 2 species in this genus, and it's believed the tree's ancient lineage diverged from the genus Bleasdaleia about 15 million years ago. Australian Vicky Lee Johnson painted the Quandong in watercolor. It is a hemiparasite in the sandalwood family and gets about 70% of its nitrogen and some of its water from the roots of other trees and shrubs. Santalum acuminatum fruit can be eaten raw, dry, or cooked, is high in vitamin C and low in sugar. Historically, the seed was eaten raw or roasted, and its oil was used to treat skin conditions. The kernels and leaves have medicinal properties, and it is being investigated as an orchard crop. I was excited to see this Lonicera cerulea by New Zealander Sarah Bisiello. It's mainly found in boreal regions and peaty soils of North America, Europe, and Asia. It's long been a forage food in the regions where it occurs, and I first tasted these berries in the garden of a friend very recently. Cultivation of this plant is also fairly recent and began in the Soviet Union in the 50s. It requires little maintenance, has few pests, and is well adapted to extremely cold climates. It is available in New Zealand for home gardeners. And who wouldn't want this beautiful bush shown to such great advantage here? Our transition image to Europe is this extraordinary painting by Irish artist Mary Dillon of Malus sylvestris, the European crabapple, considered one of the significant contributors to the genome of the cultivated apple Malus domestica. In Europe, we'll start with another quite variable species, Capsicum annuum. This one is painted by Bulgarian artist Georgi Kelarov, the hot pepper called Bulgarian carrot. It's kind of a comical name, as it does look like a carrot, but of course it doesn't taste like one. I think this rendering is quite a graphic rendering, and it's reminiscent of a seed packet illustration. Capsicum is in the nightshade family, Solanaceae, and is native to the Americas. However, in the short few hundred years since colonization, it's made its way around the world and is essential to many of the world's cuisines. Capsicum annuum contains capsaicin that varies in quantity from almost none, as in bell peppers, to high amounts that render the peppers nearly inedible. Elderberries are sometimes cultivated as an ornamental, but they also produce these wonderful and delicious little berries. Elder can be found growing wild in its native range of Europe as far east as Turkey, making them a perfect fruit for foraging. The only trouble is trying to get the berries before the other wildlife gets them. It is native in Ireland, where artist Trish Maher Hogan found them, and her watercolor accurately conveys the heavy-laden fruit clusters that show berries in various stages of ripening. And what would a show of heirloom foods be without an heirloom apple? This Panea de Norcia apple, translating to bread of the north, is painted at its pinnacle of perfection by Italian artist Maria Lombardi, and it conveys why the apple is one of the most cultivated fruits around the world today. Apples have a complex history beginning in Kazakhstan, then being hybridized and changed as they made their way both east and west through Europe and Asia, eventually colonizing every continent where Botanical Art Worldwide is active. I find the depiction of these apple leaves so beautifully conveys the gloss and texture of apple leaves at the height of their season. The only thing missing is the fragrance of the apples. And this is a beautiful painting of Olea europaea tagliasca, a regional olive variety cultivated in Italy and France and known after processing as a Niçoise olive. This variety is used in both oil production and for table fruit. Maria Rita Stirpa's painting shows her close knowledge of the growth of the tree with its leaves that are green on top and grayish on the bottom, and each leaf is painted in a different position, adding to the painting's verisimilitude. Olives at varying stages of ripening are shown, and something those of us who don't see olives on a tree rarely see, and that is the bloom on some of the olives. I think that's quite lovely. The Netherlands themed their exhibitions specifically around utilitarian plants used for dyes, and this beet by Anita Walsmith-Sachs has been used as a dye, as anyone who has ever prepared a beet can readily appreciate. However, it's also an important food crop worldwide, selected for its bulbous rootstock that is a delicious sweet vegetable when roasted, pickled, or even eaten raw. This is an example of an heirloom crop with multiple uses, as a dye plant, for sugar, as a root crop, and the greens are also edible. The watercolor of a potato, the cultivar, this is a very tongue-twisting cultivar name, Mr. Little's Yet Home Gypsy by Scottish artist Maruska Greenwood, is beautifully rendered and shows the characteristic mottled potatoes that consist of a purple layer, a red layer, and under it all, the typical tan layer. She shows the way the potato grows underground in grisaille, and adds a floral dissection with developing seeds inside. This is a potato that was developed in Scotland, but potatoes are an example of another very important crop originating in the Andean region of South America that has spread around the world. From Ukraine, Alona Rinchuk has combined media for this beautiful rendering of rhubarb. It's an example, I think, of how humans can find a delicious use for nearly any plant. The artist has beautifully captured the crinkly leaves in both graphite and watercolor, with the flower bud popping out at the center. Although it's a vegetable, it's usually put to the same uses as fruit and makes some of the best pies, crumbles, and desserts. Its leaves are poisonous. The precise origin of rhubarb isn't known. However, it is recorded in the third volume of a Chinese agricultural treatise dating back 1800 years. I love this depiction of diversity in 30 different beans by British artist Julia Trickey. Each bean is visually different, but also different in taste, and most importantly for this project, different genetically. These are all the same species, Phaseolus vulgaris, but each of these beans has been selected over generations to create a slightly different bean. Globally, there were 28 million tons of dry beans produced in 2022, and that is one of the most important assets of beans, is that they can be dried and stored for years. This legume originates in Mexico, then divided into two separate gene pools, a Mesoamerican gene pool and an Andean gene pool, before it began its world travels. British artist Sandra Doyle painted this unusual depiction of the large Dutch medlar, which can be traced back to at least 1783 in the UK. She has included a rendition of a 1499 edition of Hortus Sanitatis, with the idea of the medlars emerging from the book containing their earliest illustration. The tree she used as a subject was planted around 30 years ago, and in a vignette, she shows the tree in the shadow of the Canary Wharf buildings just across the Thames. Now on we go to South America. Our transition slide is graced with this brilliant painting by Brazilian artist Cassia Dias of blood amaranth, a native from central Mexico to Nicaragua and cultivated as a useful grain crop. Artist Carolina Calameno Machado painted the Brazilian native cassava, showing the important edible starchy tuber along with aspects of its habit. A woody shrub, it's an important staple source of carbohydrates throughout the tropics, with over 500 million people depending on it. Mostly it is boiled and eaten, but it's also processed to extract the starch called tapioca. Cassava is often grown by small holding farms who tend to retain varieties that may be less productive than commercially cultivated varieties. These less productive varieties possess genetic diversity that can be drawn upon when the widespread commercial varieties are confronted with pests, viruses, bacterial, or fungal diseases. It can be quite surprising to see the origin of the cashew nut when the only way you've seen them is the way they come to your table. It's a remarkable evergreen tree, which Dulce Nascimento has captured in all its glory in this watercolor painting. The fruits develop a pear-shaped structure called the apple, then a drupe grows at the end of it, developing a single shell-encased seed or nut. The shell can be irritating as it contains urushiol, a component best known in one of its relatives, poison ivy. A combination of graphite and watercolor was used to show this Cape gooseberry, Physalis peruviana, by Colombian artist Sarah Rios Jurado. Physalis is in the nightshade family, Solanaceae, and this one is native to Chile and Peru. Although commonly called a gooseberry, it's more closely related to tomatillo, and you can see that, like a tomatillo, Physalis has a rounded fruit reminiscent of a cherry tomato surrounded by a papery husk. This delicious, tart little fruit is now cultivated in tropical, subtropical, and temperate areas of the world. Well, sadly, we've reached the end of our botanical circumnavigation. And I thought I'd close it with this extraordinary image by Ukrainian artist Tetiana Volovic of an heirloom squash called Musc de Provence, sliced open to reveal its colorful and nutritious interior. In this image, combining a ripe vegetable, its own fresh seeds, and a little sprout of new life, is distilled the central idea of our project. We hope this project brings more attention to the importance of retaining diversity in our essential crop plants, helping to encourage the sprouting of an abundant future.